Hi everybody, welcome to our first Ask DETS discussion, where we are going to talk about exempt versus non-exempt employee statuses. My name is Lauren Byram. I am a HR consultant with Deep End Talent Strategies. I have over 13 years of HR experience in large and small companies and in various industries. So I'm going to be your host for today, and I am super excited that you are here joining us. So as far as the agenda goes and what we're going to be chatting about, we're going to talk about the FLSA, violations underneath the FLSA, common employer mistakes, what is the real difference between exempt versus non-exempt employees, positions that are exempt from the FLSA wage and overtime pay requirements. I'm going to give you some key takeaways and reminders to take back to your employers. And then at the end, we will have a Q&A time. So if you have any questions, just drop them in the chat so that way we can go through them during that time. I look forward to taking you through these topics. So let's dive on in. We're going to start off by talking about the Fair Labor Standards Act, more commonly known as the FLSA. So let me give you a little bit of history about the FLSA. It was signed into law in 1938. The basic provisions of the FLSA and why it was created was to address child labor laws, the minimum wage law, as well as to ensure overtime payment. So as far as child labor laws go, it restricts the hours that children underneath the age of 16 can work and forbids the employment of children underneath the age of 18 in certain jobs deemed too dangerous. Also, it prohibits the employment of children underneath the age of 16 during working hours. Moving into the minimum wage and overtime pay portion of the FLSA, all employees are considered non-exempt or not exempt from coverage unless the employee's position meets specific exemption criteria, or unless the regulations specifically allow an exemption and the employer has opted to use that exemption. There was an amendment made to the FLSA in 1963 to include the Equal Pay Clause. The Equal Pay Act under the FLSA prohibits gender-based wage discrimination, which I think is a pretty great addition and amendment to this. So we're going to move into FLSA violations and why it's really important for you as a steward of your employer to understand what the FLSA is and how to protect your employer from any penalties. So some examples of penalties for FLSA violations. So if an FLSA investigator may come in and they may recommend changes in employment practices to bring about compliance to make sure that you're compliant with the laws underneath the FLSA. Employers who willfully or repeatedly violate the minimum wage overtime pay requirements are subject to civil money penalties of up to $1,100 per violation. So if you think about how many employees you have, if they're categorized incorrectly, that could really add up. So make sure that you do your FLSA evaluations, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Also, there are violations of the Equal Pay Act underneath the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, also known as the EEOC. Examples of penalties for violations are, and what can happen is, they could recovery of compensation damages for intentional discrimination, as well as punitive damages for intentional discrimination by engaging in malice or reckless indifference to the federally protected rights of all employees. There are caps on the amount of compensatory and punitive damages which are determined by the size of your employer. There are some statutes of limitations as well. So typically an action for back wages of overtime should go back 2 years from the date that the error was found. So make sure that you keep that in mind if you ever have to run into this. So now for the bulk of, why most of you guys are probably here is, let's break down exempt versus non-exempt and the differences of both. So exempt employees should meet one of the FLSA exemption test categories. They are paid on a fixed salary basis and are not entitled to overtime pay. As stated, exempt employees are paid on a salary basis, which means employees will regularly receive a predetermined amount of money based off of your pay schedule. So that's bi-weekly, bi-monthly, however you guys are pay. And it is not subject to reduction because of variations in quality or quantity of work performed. Now, some examples of that would be, a partial day of absence, jury duty, maybe military duty, or, possibly not even having any work available at all. So, some things to keep in mind. Now, as we transition into non-exempt employees, some things to keep in mind is that non-exempt employees do not meet any of the FLSA exemption tests and are paid on an hourly basis. They are protected by wage and hour laws regarding, the minimum wage, overtime pay, and hours worked. One thing to keep in mind, overtime pay must be paid out at no less than 1.5 times their base hourly rate at a minimum. Another thing to keep in mind, paid absences or leaves are not counted as time worked for purposes of calculating overtime. So make sure that you keep that in mind and ensure that you track their hours appropriately. Going into tracking hours and record keeping for non-exempt employees, the FLSA does require employers to keep time records for all hours worked. Example being total hours in a day, piece rate, overtime earnings, etc. Likewise, payroll records must be kept for at least 3 years per the FLSA's guidance, and time cards must be kept for at least 2 years. So make sure that you put a provision in your record keeping, or however you do your record keeping, to make sure that you keep those for that amount of time. So we're going to move into common employer mistakes, which is, a few areas that we can really help you out. Hopefully you get some tips to take away to your employer after today's training. But, also, if you ever need any help, we are here for you. So, number one common mistake is a company could do is, labeling an employee who is paid a salary as an exempt employee just because their title maybe sounds like it should be an exempt title. So you must first qualify the employee for a job-specific related FLSA exemption by conducting an exemption test, and we'll talk a lot about that process and how to do that within this presentation. If there's any doubt, we recommend to pay the employees as a non-exempt employee in the interim until you have completed the exemption tests. That way the employee is being paid for all hours worked and any overtime worked, and that way you won't be in violation of any of the FLSA's guidelines in that interim period. The next thing would be, as a common employer mistake, would be not paying for unauthorized overtime. So now you're probably like, why would we pay somebody for working overtime if it wasn't authorized? Well, working unauthorized overtime is a disciplinary issue. It is not a compensation issue. So no matter what, you have to pay your employees for the hours that they have worked if they are non-exempt. So as a takeaway, you'll really want to make sure that you use your disciplinary guidelines to reprimand employees that have, worked unauthorized overtime. So the last one we're going to chat about is automatic deduction. So making automatic pay deductions for meal breaks without making sure an employee has actually taken that unpaid meal break is a huge mistake, because they could come back and ask for payment of those breaks if they were actually working while they should have been in an unpaid break time. So make sure that you check all of your automatic deductions and validate that your employees have actually taken that time off. So we're going to transition into exempt position categories, and these positions are exempt from the FLSA wage and overtime pay requirements. There are 6 exempt categories, and they are as follows. So we have the executive, which is a director level, VP and above. Professionals who receive a learned or a certificate, such as a nurse. Professionals who are creative, such as a composer. Administrative, which this kind of can be a misnomer in that A lot of the positions underneath the administrative category are actually management and supervisors. So don't let that word scare you, that it's not just, executive assistants and things of that nature. Those do fall underneath this category. However, it's mainly management and supervisors. Outside sales employees, as an example, sales reps, certain computer professionals, which in our world today, IT is huge. So you will make sure, or I implore you to make sure that you really look at your FLSA guidelines for all of your IT professionals. One example would be a developer that would be exempt from the FLSA guidelines. But just a recommendation, I would make sure that you do that for all of your IT professionals. And then highly compensated employees, such as like real estate professionals. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that all of these in this category have one constant per the FLSA to be exempt. They must be paid at least $684 weekly, which equates to about $35,568 annually on a salary basis, in order to be exempt. So that is a threshold that has gone up in the past few years, and so you will want to keep that in mind whenever you are paying somebody at least the minimum threshold. Some states are different and have higher thresholds. There are always caveats. So some of those states would be California, Colorado, Maine, Washington, and then some specific counties in New York State. We are heading towards the end of this presentation, so I want to make sure that you leave today with some key takeaways that you can take back to your employer and make sure that you implement. And just some things to remember. So an exempt employee, they are paid on a fixed amount for work performed, which is averaged out over the year, and they are not entitled to overtime pay. Non-exempt staff, on the other hand, is entitled to at least time and a half for any services performed over the 40 hours a week threshold, or in some states it's 8 hours in a day, such as California or those counties in New York. Before classifying and treating any employee as exempt from receiving overtime, employers should confirm that the employee satisfies all applicable tests for overtime exemption underneath the federal and the state laws. If an employee is covered by both federal and state laws but doesn't meet both sets of tests, employers should consult with outside counsel such as Deep End Talent Strategies to determine how they should classify the employee in that particular situation. So like I said earlier, we are always here to help. Okay, so we are going to be moving into the question and answer section of this presentation. We did receive some questions in the chat, so thank you for everybody that's listening and have put them in the chat, as well as some questions from some of our clients that had sent in questions so that way we could chat about them during this time frame. So I'm just going to take a drink and we're going to jump on in. Okay, so if an employee's status changes to exempt or non-exempt, do I have to change their pay or responsibilities? This is a great question. So I always implore you to be as transparent as possible with your employees, because I think that helps you build credibility with them. So yes, I think the pay or responsibilities changing will predicate you changing the status, not the other way around. So making sure that you are upfront with them and honest with them is always the best practice. Similarly, in the next question, do I have to tell my employees that I am changing their classification? Yes, you should tell them that their classification is changing. This normally would accompany a job description change as well as a compensation change. So I think it would be in your best interest to make sure that you notify them that their classification is changing, because there's other things that go along with that, and the employee would want to know, just like you would probably want to know. Okay, next question. Can I have managers who are classified as non-exempt employees? This is a really good one, and does not happen very often, I will say. So yes, in very rare situations, Managers are typically exempt due to their yearly pay total being above that $684 weekly threshold. However, one thing to keep in mind is, a manager could be managing just one person. And in the non-for-profit world, as an example, maybe they don't make that much money in a week. So then they would actually be classified as non-exempt because in order to be classified as exempt, you need to manage at least 2 people and you need to make at least that $35,568 annually. So something to keep in mind. Again, it only happens in very rare situations, but it does happen. So yes, managers can be classified as non-exempt employees. Okay, next question. Do all people in the same position have to be classified the same? The answer is no. And I kind of spoke on this a little bit earlier in regards to like different state laws, different federal laws. One example being, if you have an employee in California that is doing the same work as somebody in Indiana or whatever the state that has the different laws, California's minimum wage threshold is more than Indiana's. So each employee needs to ensure that they are classified according to the state that they are physically living in. Now we have a lot of people who are ambient workers or work remotely, so they really need, this is important for you to always have their physical location or their home base, so that way you can, file taxes accordingly. That way you can make sure that you're up to date on the FLSA requirements. So it is very important to have, updated information. And per this, question, no, they don't have to be classified the same. So that's a great question. Okay, so what if the employee meets the salary requirement, but they don't actually meet the responsibility requirements? What would they be classified as? So this is a great question and is commonly asked. There's a 2-step quick test that you can complete. Does the pay meet the federal and state requirements? And then you want to review the required duties. Are they given autonomy to make decisions in the business, or do they have hiring decisions? So those are the two. Does their pay meet the federal requirements and state requirements? And then review their required duties. Are they autonomous, and do they make hiring decisions? To be classified as exempt, both questions 1 and 2 must be answered yes. If one of them is answered no, then they would be non-exempt. They must answer both yes. So that is a quick test, 2-step test, just to see, if the employee meets this, the salary requirements. Okay. Ooh, this is a good one. Can I require exempt employees to work overtime? So we've talked a little bit about this in the presentation, that yes, a individual who is exempt, it's almost expected that, you're being paid more, you have more responsibilities, you're probably going to work overtime, and you're not going to be held to the same standards as a non-exempt employee, such as like punching a time clock, things like that. And it is required, most likely, that you're going to be having to work overtime as part of your role. It just is what it is. So this next question must have come from the same person. Can I have part-time employees who are exempt? That's a very interesting question. So yes, a part-time employee may be classified as exempt. Again, it really just breaks down to the minimum salary and duties requirements must still be met, and then the minimum salary cannot be prorated when an exempt employee works part-time. So if somebody makes over that $35,000 and their job requirements and duties are, making decisions, hiring decisions, autonomy, they are autonomous, they are going to be classified as exempt whether they're part-time or not. So that's a great question. Okay, so does the classification of exempt or non-exempt affect other benefits that the company provides? This is a really good question, and I do have this come up with clients sometimes. And let me break it down for you in both categories. So As a non-exempt employee, you have the benefit of being compensated for all of the hours worked, particularly if you work overtime. However, you likely won't be having as much flexibility as a salary or exempt employee does, because they have more expectations on them in their job duties. So then, conversely, as an exempt employee, you have much more flexibility with your time. I would say employers are often more interested in just getting the work done rather than how much time that it takes. And this, in and of itself, would offer more flexibility and benefits, such as, somebody could take a longer lunch break, paid time off, and then also working remotely, which is huge in the world today. So that is also an added benefit of somebody that's working exempt. I would say if you have a non-exempt employee that's working remotely, that's something that I would hope you would want to steer clear of, just because it's hard to track hours. Okay, can a non-exempt employee be salaried? That is a great question. So normally salaried and exempt, they go together. However, there are certain circumstances where a non-exempt employee could be salaried but overtime eligible. So although not all non-exempt employees are generally paid on an hourly basis, they may be paid on a salary, commission, or a piece rate basis. However, regardless of the basis of pay, all non-exempt employees must be paid the appropriate overtime rate for hours worked over 40 in that work week. Thus, the non-exempt employees' hours must still be tracked each week, and they must still be maintained by the employer for those couple of years for record-keeping compliance, and overtime payments must be paid. That's a good question. Okay, what should I do if I think that I am not classified correctly? I've not had this ever asked, so as from an employee perspective. So I would first say to inquire with your manager. I think it's always important to be upfront with your manager if you have any questions about your employment, things like that. And then from there, the manager or supervisor really should reach out to HR to confirm the FLSA status, because there are other things that will come about after that question has been asked, such as reviewing your job description. I think when you do ask that, putting together a list of all of your job duties would be an appropriate next step, just so that way, they can kind of see the correlation between the two, understand where you're coming from, and it would really help expedite the process. So yeah, I would speak to your manager first, and then they hopefully will speak to HR. Okay. This is a good one too. Our overtime pay is a big selling point for our employees. If we move to exempt and take that away, it will hurt our recruiting efforts. Why would we do that? We all know that Great Resignation has really hurt a lot of employers. However, we also need to make sure that the decision being made by the employer benefits the employer, I should say. Some of the reasons that I would say that a company would move to, having an exempt employee rather than a non-exempt employee and paying overtime, as long as the job duties align, is that the employer will no longer need to track hours if a position is classified as exempt rather than non-exempt. Also, time cards would go away, so hours would no longer need to be tracked, making the payroll process easier, as well as the manager's job easier, because the manager or supervisor is really the one that's going to be attesting that employee worked these said hours that they have put on their timesheet, and then also approving any overtime. So it would just make the employer's and manager's job easier. I think this was also asked by the same person, maybe. My employees will make less money if they are not getting paid overtime. So in these situations, which I have actually had come about not quite often, but with some of our clients, I recommend a compensation analysis be completed to see if the overall salary should be adjusted to compensate employees for the work that they are completing based off of how much they made the previous year, as well as how much the role makes in the market as an exempt employee. So I think that it is a valid question, and I do think that employers who get moved from non-exempt to exempt are always nervous about this. However, I do think that you need to do a compensation analysis if this is going to happen with one of your positions to make sure that you give the employee peace of mind that they're not going to be doing the same role but making less money if they're moved to exempt. So yeah, that's what I would say to do, is a compensation analysis. So the next question, I'm honestly not sure if my team is classified correctly, and I think this is the last one. What do I have to do to see if I am compliant? So this is a great question, and it kind of goes back to what I was talking about a little bit earlier, where you will want to complete an FLSA analysis. And the easiest one to do is that two-step analysis that I was talking about, where does the pay meet the federal and state requirements, and you will want to review the required duties. Are they given autonomy to make business decisions, and do they make hiring decisions? So if both of those are yes, then I would say that, and if your employees are classified as exempt, I would say that yes, they are classified correctly. Now, if they are non-exempt and the answers to both of those is yes, then they are not classified obviously correctly. So take that two-step test. If both are yes, they are exempt. If one of them is yes and one of them is no, they are non-exempt. If both no, non-exempt. So that is the last question that I had from the chat. I really appreciate everybody's time today and coming and listening about exempt versus non-exempt. I know that it's a topic that comes up a lot whenever we are working on job descriptions or compensation analysis, or just in general, should somebody be classified as exempt, salaried, non-exempt, hourly. We are always here for you. Please reach out to Deep End Talent Strategies if you need anything. And I hope that you have learned something new today and can take that away back to your employer. Thank you so much for being here. Our next Ask DETS session is on December the 14th, where Shauna Lake is going to talk about a PEO versus an HRO, which is Deep End Talent Strategies is considered an HRO, or an outsourced HR. So I hope that you will join us then, and I appreciate you being here. Have a great day. Bye.